Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is an notorious open-source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode.
Hello, everybody. This is the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm your host, Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer at Artorias. And today we are joined by actually a good friend of Artorias, Nuno Felix, somebody that we've had a long history in the OSINT space on Twitter, or also known as X. And we're very excited to welcome him today on this episode. Nuno is a former First Sergeant of the Portuguese Special Forces and currently a consultant and an expert in geopolitics and military affairs. Nuno, first, thank you so much for joining us.
Matt, it's a pleasure to be in the podcast. First of all, thank you for the invitation, man. We indeed go quite a while back now, to the early days of the Ukraine war. So quite a few years by now. First of all, let me say that it was great seeing your company and the podcast to grow. It's an amazing thing you guys done, and your work in Latin America and the dynamics of cartels and whatnot is absolutely astonishing. Props for that, man. It's great, and it's great to be here. Yeah.
Nuno, thanks. And for those who might recall, if you were part of the Russia-Ukraine breaking news spaces when the invasion started, with OSINT Defender, Intel Hub, all that, Nuno was one of the regular speakers, and that's how we met each other. So we have a long history of coordinating a lot. And what I like about Nuno, and the reason why I wanted to do this episode is I think a lot of times when we have in conversations and we do our podcast, we kind of center it maybe from an American-centric perspective. Obviously, we do analysis from an American's perspective, not only from your background, again, as a former Special Forces member of the Portuguese military and the Portuguese Special Operations community, but you're also very well connected kind of in the European Union and the EU dynamics. And you're a great guest to kind of have to provide maybe a little bit more Eurocentric analysis and the various conflicts that we have going on and the crises and the geopolitical one. And so obviously, though, before we kind of get started, I think there's just a quick summary of the key events while we're doing this recording. That this recording, by the way, is being done on 24 May, Sunday. Yesterday, on Saturday, 23 May, the United States and Iran appear to have at least broadly agreed to a memorandum of understanding, or an MOU, to kind of end the conflict with Iran. Although the deal, as of this recording, has not been finalized and signed, there does appear to have been broad agreements where President Trump announced on his Truth Social, after having conversations with a wide swath of leaders in the Middle East, and then later on with Israel, Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, said that basically there is an idea of an extending the ceasefire for 60 days that then will enable deeper negotiations for the nuclear program. And broadly speaking, a lot of the details are in flux, but basically the Straits of Hormuz would be opened by Iran with no tolls. And then we have the United States ending the naval blockade, and the U.S. has stated that Iran is committed to removing their nuclear enrichment, although Iran, at least publicly, has denied that. So again, a lot of developments in the Middle East. There's also the news about the U.S. Against Cuba, where the pressure against the Castro and the communist government continues to increase in the deployment of carrier strike group in the Caribbean, and negotiations there with the arrival earlier last week. The CIA Director Ratcliffe negotiating with the Cubans, and looking like maybe the Castros and the communist government's times are numbered, and the indictment of former President Raul Castro. And then obviously we have the situation in Russia, Ukraine, where it looks like Ukraine might have at least a tactical advantage, since in April of 2026 was the first time Ukraine gained more territories than lost, and the Russians might be having difficulties there. So with all those different things, Nuno's, that are going on, I'd love to start with the Iran conflict. And broadly speaking, that did cause a lot of tensions between the Trump administration and NATO and the European Union, which clearly, I think the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, received the most amount of ire from the United States, but also the Germans, Chancellor Merz. And then it looked like even the polls were going to suffer as well. But now it looks like President Trump is deploying 5,000 U.S. troops to Poland, really committing his political and personal alliance there. So, broadly speaking, I mean, what is the European perspective about the U.S. war with Iran? Was this from their perspective, a geopolitical blunder? Was this a perfect opportunity to reduce maybe the axis of resistance and the lead state sponsor of terror? What are your opinions and kind of from the European mindset of the U.S. actions in Iran?
So, and I told you offline that we would have quite a bit to discuss today about Iran. Um, the thing is, with Iran, there's no love for the Iranian regime in Europe or European Union, in the European Union in Europe as a whole. There's no love for the regime. The Spanish government is a particular case. I'll touch on that, but it's basically a particular case because of its own internal politics. Okay, it's more a symptom of a government with some very significant internal pressures and internal problems than exactly. Uh, an issue with Iran itself and the war in Iran. And if you look at the early days of the war, and despite all that's been said and all that's been written about how Europe doesn't support the war and whatnot, the problem for Europe is the strait was closed, right? Which was the most obvious outcome of any operation against Iran. It was basically the baseline scenario of any scenario of a war against Iran. Um, and European countries were not consulted, not even the British, who are a Five Eyes country, were consulted. And that created some political um, tensions with the US. All the talk about Europe not stepping up or not helping, that's not true. There's some countries, Spain being the biggest outlier, but the U.S. military has operated unhindered basically across Europe, from resupply flights, from air to air resupply, refuel, sorry, flights out of the Azores, which the Portuguese government authorized immediately, to bases in uh, the UK, like Lakenheath and Fairford, to the obviously the use of German bases. And as you know, and most of your listeners will probably know, the biggest hub of military of the US military in Europe is the complex of bases the US has in Germany, mainly Ramstein and then the hospital in Landstuhl and other locations it has around Germany, even for the military and for the intelligence community of the US. So a lot of operations are handled out of Germany, and then obviously the support the US has in Crete, in Greece, and also the bases out of. Despite all the tension with the Italian government, there was not an issue with resupplies and refueling operations out of Sigonella and Aviano. So all the simmering social media tension that we've seen, basically, when you go look at it, and you look at the flights and you look at the basically the logistics strain of the operation, you'll see even the French allowed transit through their airspace and whatnot. So there's not really an issue there. Uh, the Spanish case is a very particular one. There's, as I said, a lot of internal political tension stemming from the absolutely enormous corruption of the Sanchez government. There's all kinds of scandals out of that government. As someone famously said here in Portugal, um, Pedro Sanchez is a guy with distinctive bad luck because his wife is indicted, his political allies are indicted. Um, his uh, his wife's father is indicted apparently, and he has ministers indicted. It's a guy with some bad luck. Um, with the most some of it some crazy stories involving including involving Delcy Rodriguez, the current president of Venezuela. So there's all kinds of issues there, and the Sanchez government is basically anchored in the support of the far left in Spain in parliamentary terms. So he needs to count out that particular demography, and he cannot be seen taking the side of Israel, taking the side of the US, and taking the side of the US supporting Israel. So there's that to account for. And obviously, there was a lot of tension with Madrid, basically because Madrid stopped the US from using the base at Rota. Now, with that said, the biggest issue here is obviously there's a spike in inflation from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which was pretty obvious. And there was a kind of a waiting pattern because the moment that the operation launched, you saw European leadership from Friedrich Merz, Macron, the European Union leadership with von der Leyen and whatnot, basically saying the regime needed to change. We understand the operation to give it a bit of room to see how would the dynamics on the ground evolve, right? And that it and to see if the regime really would face internal turmoil and would face a chance of collapse. Obviously, the issue here, Stefano, is did the regime, the moment the regime did not collapse, in fact, I think we are in a much more precarious situation with this regime than the previous players. But I'll get into that if you want. But the rub here is the moment we saw that there's obviously tactical capabilities, there's obviously the US and Israel conducted what is, for all accounts, a very robust tactical campaign. Targets were thousands of sorties were generated, targets were hit, um, the regime was decapitated, and but there's no internal resistance or no internal insurgency that materialized. There was some talk about the Kurds eventually doing something in the north of Iran, but as always, Turkey and Azerbaijan said no way. Even even if someone should have talked with Azerbaijan, and to an extent, Azerbaijan helped Israel stage some operations from there. And some of the targets hit in the Caspian were with Azerbaijani help, enabling help. Anyway, all of this, the moment the new players in Tehran consolidated, um, and there was no sign of internal tensions or internal um, problems that would may cause the end of the regime. And the moment the regime shut the Strait of Hormuz and start attacking the oil and gas infrastructure in the Gulf, uh, there was obviously from Europe the perspective that okay, so this is not producing the results, and we are headed to an energy crisis, an inflation crisis, and a supply crisis for that matter. And we're not out of the woods with that, not even remotely. and that clearly trickled into European public opinion. And the obvious thing happened. I mean, any politician worth its salt, from Pedro Sanchez to Alice Weidel of the AFD in Germany, and everyone in between, got the idea that it was popular to be against the intervention and to criticize the Americans and the Israelis for the intervention. And everybody tried their hand at it. I mean, sometimes I think the US sometimes, and the Israelis in particular, but the US sometimes forgets that um, there's layers of politics in Europe. There's the national layer of politics, but there's also a European Union layer of politics, right? And the public opinion in Europe is not only the national public opinion, but it's also an European Union public opinion, in the European public opinion as a whole, if you count Norway and if you count Switzerland and the UK and countries that are not European Union. And that in itself is something that I think Washington sometimes discounts, is the level of public opinion discourse within the European Union and within Europe, and the politics of it. I mean, everybody's got their own politics. That's for sure. Even the Iranians. So, in that sense, I think it was an unfortunate issue, and obviously, that's not. It's not beneficial to have the culture warriors we have in some of the undersecretaries of state
Well,
currently in the U.S. Department of
I,
State.
I think one of the interesting aspects in with this administration, obviously, where the Trump administration has been, has been, taking that stride from a conservative cultural warfare perspective. I guess their counter argument is like, in the U.S. liberal parties, like the Democratic Party, would have done the same, just from a gay rights, et cetera. And so there's kind of this framing, but really using that from migration, DEI and all that. Obviously, they're much more involved, at least in the public side. But I do have a question for you, because during the war, we got a lot of reports and and then we saw a lot of conferences and meetings led by the French and the UK about this maritime coalition to reopen the Straits of Hormuz, in coordination with the Gulf allies and partners. Is this a situation though? Because we do know the French Charles de Gaulle is off the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf,
Mhm.
up in the Indian Ocean. There's other naval assets there. I believe the UK have kind of pushed assets also that way. I think it's important to note that during the war, Cyprus, an EU member, was targeted,
By
specifically.
Hezbollah drone. Yeah.
Correct. And the UK, the French, I believe even the Italians and the Spanish, the EU did send naval forces there to protect Cyprus, who is not a member of NATO but is a member of the European Union. They
Mhm.
did send naval forces there to protect Cyprus, who was attacked. Specifically, it looks like the targets were the UK military bases there in Cyprus.
Akrotiri.
Yep,
Akrotiri.
Akrotiri. And so now those naval assets, though, appear to be moving, and they're active right now in the Indian Ocean. Obviously, the EU still has an anti-piracy and freedom of navigation operation more related to the Houthis in the Gulf of Aden.
The
And then the
Spiders
racing.
operation.
Yep. So the question that I have for you, Nuno, is: do you believe we might see the EU initiate now that if an agreement is reached and MOU is signed, will the EU or the European countries lead a naval mission to ensure the Straits of Hormuz continues to be open when all parties diplomatically looks like will agree to that?
I think, first of all, it's a good thing you brought up Cyprus, because it was the first operational demonstration, let's put it this way, of a very unknown uh, article in the European Union Treaty, which is the 42nd article, Article 42.7, which is basically the common self-defense mechanism of the European Union. And it was the French deployed Charles de Gaulle carrier strike group, augmented with uh, some of Italy's ships, some Italian ships, and some Spanish and Greek ships too. Uh, an important point here, in from a military perspective, um, the UK, especially the Royal Navy, uh, doesn't come out of this with a good picture. Let's put it this way: they took about 2 weeks to get a ship out, and the French basically sortied the Marine Nationale within the first 24 hours. So that's quite a display of capability by France, and also to a very significant extent by Italy. And the Spanish brought in some assets too, and there were some air defense assets sent by the French and the Italians to defend Cyprus. With that, the moment then the talk became, and these meetings became the idea of a maritime operation to guarantee the Strait of Hormuz transit after a sort of a peace deal is signed. There's one area here where the Europeans clearly can help, which is minesweepers. We have quite an amount of minesweepers available, especially the Belgian, the French too. There's a number of them. The Italians, and the Italians already moved them, some of them, towards the Gulf. Um, but, and this is a big but, we'll see how politically will this agreement and this memorandum of understanding, because from what we've seen right now, we are discussing talks about talks, right? That's an important point. It's for now we're seeing, okay, there's going to be another 60-day ceasefire with a number of other things happening, eventually sanctions relief, eventually the transit of Hormuz being um, reopened. But my question is, okay, we have 60 days of this in an MOU. Uh, Very well. Um, will the shipping insurance prices will remain high? And if they remain high, what ships will transit into the Gulf? Because there's a lot of ships stranded within the Gulf and ships stranded outside the Gulf. Um, and the moment these ships start crossing, it will take some time for traffic to become a regular thing. So we're those 60 days are not enough to um, get that to a normal place, right? Will the Iranians agree to an operation, an enhanced military presence to make sure they cannot close the strait again while they're still negotiating the fine print of the agreement? I don't think so, because that means that if everything fails, if there's no agreement in the end on the nuclear issue, on regime issues, on on the Strait of Hormuz, then what? Then you have a lot of Western and NATO assets in present there, and it will be considerably harder for the Iranians to close the Gulf. So I think we'll be in a waiting pattern for quite a bit now. I don't see the Europeans moving without some clarity on the terms, both from the US and Israel and from Iran. That's my view. Okay, I may be wrong, but I don't see anyone moving without clarity of, okay, if is this a peace agreement, or is this basically a codification of the ceasefire, and as we move to the next stage of negotiations that have a predetermined um, uh, deadline, right? So unless there's quite a bit of clarity there, I don't see anyone moving to strengthen the Gulf. And the thing is, those ships, even the U.S. Navy, those ships can be out there permanently, right? Um, we'll need to start rotating assets, and we have a number of assets. We have bases there. The French have bases there. The British have bases there. But I mean, there's got to be some rotation as time goes by. So we'll see what happens, and we need more clarity. I think nobody in Europe will move without some more clarity on the exact terms of what we're dealing with and how will it pan out, right? And it for now, it's not clear exactly what the terms are.
No, and I think it's also important to know that during the war, both the French and the UK were very active and at least defensive natures in shooting down Iranian drones targeting the Gulf
Yes.
countries, and even some of them that transitioned over to Israel. We've seen that continuation since 2025. The UK, it was very interesting that naval kind of problems that they ran into, and a lot of their forces was much more centered on Russia, and so it took them a long time to reposition it to Cyprus and now to the Middle East. But at least from an air domain, the UK specifically, I think it's fair to say, punched above their weight, and as well as the French, which I guess goes to kind of this other conversation, right? I mean, even though the UK is not part of the European Union, clearly they're part of the European security architecture, even within the construct of, obviously, we're looking at NATO. But even within the EU, that, after Brexit, the UK is playing ball with this, right? And they're in many ways you can look at them as a reliable partner of the
Mhm.
European Union. So my question is, I mean, is this a situation where, I mean, we've seen historically, we've had these conversations of this difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Obviously, Poland has significantly increased their military budget. We've seen the Baltic countries, now Sweden and Finland, part of NATO, but very strong military powers. But it still looks like, even with all that and this idea of Eastern Europe, that the military center of Europe continues to be London and Paris. And although Berlin is increasing their military expenditure, it looks like, though, the decision makers, at least de facto wise, is London and Paris. Do you agree with that assessment, Nuno, or do you think we're maybe underestimating the power, let's say, of Rome, Berlin, or maybe Warsaw? Where do you see the military center of Europe, at least in a reality perspective, rather than a de jure perspective?
Grounded in reality, I'd say that there are two different conditions here, two different issues here. If you're talking defense of the continent, uh, there's, I think, three, four. There's actually four pillars, basically. Obviously, France, obviously Poland, Finland, and the Nordics, but Finland, centered around Finland. And the other is centered around Italy and the southern countries, but centered around, obviously, Italy. And obviously, the UK plays a big role. It's a nuclear power. There's always that. It has long-standing treaties with so many European countries, including obviously Portugal, who is Britain's oldest ally. Um, and the Treaty of Windsor dates back to the 14th century. But the military center, there's no way around being Poland, Finland, France, and Italy. And I'll give you very specific reasons for this. Finland and Poland are by far the biggest land armies in Europe. No way around that. They're the biggest land armies, the biggest mass, um, but they are very, very in, tailored to continental defense, right? Large ground forces, significant air power, fires, basically focused on uh, Russia and on defending the continent from Russia. France is a particular case in the sense that the French retain a strategic reach with their air power, a strategic reach with their logistics and their navy, and obviously a very capable expeditionary, large expeditionary army with significant uh, fighting capability, and but basically they're geared towards strategic reach and expeditionary operations. But they're by far the Marine Nationale, for instance, and the French Air Force are the biggest. Maybe sometimes not in numbers, but it was some of the most capable in Europe by far, and the most experienced by far. And then why Italy? Because Italy always gets like doesn't get much attention. But if you look at the Italian Navy, their capabilities, their numbers, and if you look at one simple fact, the United States Air Force Special Operations Command um, certified uh, I believe the 17 Stormo Incursore unit of the Italian Air Force Special Forces for global entry operations. So the Italians have been developing their capabilities quite well. Their naval capabilities and their shipbuilding capabilities are uh, excellent. Basically, they are some of the best. They have the best, some of the best shipyards in anywhere in the world. And they have committed to a plan to rebuild their navy, rebuild their army, expand it. And they've done so. It's not a Meloni thing. They've done so across very different governments, very different political families, but a very but they all pursued these plans from a strategic sense. So Italy is one of the centers of gravity. There's no way around that. And when you look at the UK, the UK faces availability problems. In the Royal Navy, they face some serious issues with the Royal Navy. They face some serious issues with the Army. And obviously, they're a nuclear power. Obviously, they retain some very interesting and very key capabilities. Obviously, they are a cornerstone of the continent's defense. But if you ask me, are they one of the centers of gravity in military terms? They aren't. Never tell them that; they'll be pissed, but they aren't.
Well, this is a recorded podcast, but no, I mean I guess from a you're highlighting a capabilities perspective, and it's interesting. So actually, I do want to take that opportunity and ask you this following question that can kind of get us to the next geopolitical crisis that I think is much more important for Europe, even comparative to the United States. But obviously is Russia, Ukraine, but kind of tying into this conversation of these military centers in Europe. Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently did an interview where he stated that right now Ukraine probably has the most powerful military in Europe.
Yes.
Obviously, because of the war against Ukraine and other findings, we've seen in multiple occasions, not only from the Trump administration, but senior military officials briefing Congress and reporting from the Secretary of Army, Dan Driscoll, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and others have all praised Ukraine's command and control systems, and more importantly, their drones and how they've been employing drones and how the United States is trying to apply lessons learned and how to do the drones. So my question to you, Nuno, obviously highlight the strengths and maybe weaknesses that you might see within the Ukrainian military. But I guess the question then becomes, if Ukraine either joins the European Union or joins NATO, or even if they don't, but obviously the relationships between Ukraine and the EU and Europe as a whole has continued to just solidify and strengthen. Should we now be looking at Ukraine, even if the war is over, as the next bedrock and the center of gravity for European security?
For the defense of the continent, yes. Definitely. There's Ukraine. I left Ukraine out because of the very simple reason, because the Ukrainian army is currently in its current form, in the Ukrainian defense industrial base in its current form. It's 100% geared towards fighting the war, right? Um, and that in itself uh, creates a level of mobilization and a level of expenditure in the military that is not the same as peacetime situation. Even if I disagree that we are in a state of peace, we are not. Europe is currently, at best, in a state of unpeace, and there's a very good book talking about it. It's called The Age of Unpeace. I can't remember the author; it's my fault, but and that's a very interesting book that defines basically what will be the next, in my view, the next decade. But that's a whole different conversation. However, Ukraine is essential, and I left Germany out. People will say, but what about Germany? It's biggest spender in Europe in the military. Sure, but Germany has several issues. Three issues, I'd say, with the Germans. They have a lot of ground to cover from where they were to where they want to be, um, and they really need to get that procurement working. Uh, Another one is Germany needs to find its own strategic culture, which the French have, the British have, to an extent, the Italians and others have, but the Germans simply, there's no big strategic culture in Germany. And obviously, Germany can throw industry and money at it like there's no tomorrow. Um, but and Germany has played a pivotal role in supporting Ukraine. Let's be That's the other side of this equation, which is all of what we see in Ukraine right now is also a great part of it. A big part of it is German industry and German money that enabled it, right? So, but Germany is not, for now, one of the centers of gravity in European defense. This will anger the Germans, I know, but if you manage to anger the British and the Germans in the same podcast, not bad. Um, anyway, regarding Ukraine, obviously Ukraine, and I saw also what Sacher has said, General Greenwich has said, um, and what others, even U.S. military leaders and especially Secretary of the Army Dan Driscoll said, and it's absolutely correct. The Ukrainians at this point have an adaptation cycle, an innovation cycle in military capabilities that surpasses anyone, even the US. Um, of course, if you're talking exquisite high end systems, right? 6th gen fighters and stealth bombers and space based assets and stuff like that, nobody surpasses the US for now, because that's a whole different ball game.
So actually, let me ask you though, from the European perspective, right? Is there I mean, we did see in the beginning of the Trump administration and kind of now a very hostile approach to Europe, to NATO. If we were to look at kind of key figures, maybe that outside of just JD Vance, the vice president, Albert Colby, right, the undersecretary.
Helbridge Colby.
Yes, the undersecretary of War for Policy, a very, very senior position within the DOW. But it does look like there's still some transatlantic voices within this administration, maybe even led by Marco Rubio, who was just recently in Europe, and having conversations there. Obviously, the situation with Greenland really puts a lot of stress within the transatlantic alliance.
Yes.
So I guess the question is Europe viewing the entirety of the Trump administration cautiously, hostile wise? Do they view them as antagonistics to the European project? Or is this more there's certain members within the administration that you feel more comfortable dealing with and excluding others? Because we did see again, the Department of War and Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, announced pulling out of troops not only of Germany, but even from canceling a deployment to Poland, only for President Trump to subsequent reporting saying, what is going on? Why would you do this? I actually get along with the president of Poland. He's a political ally of mine. Now I'm deploying 5,000 troops over to Poland. It looks like the troops that were kind of removed from Germany
Germany were going to
are getting
Poland.
sent to Poland, closer to Russia. So with all
That's
that
a good thing.
yeah, right. It's kind of ironic, but again, I mean, we do have Greenland, we have all these other concepts. I mean, and I think we have to make a quick asterisk, if I may. I think nobody can dispute the power of Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, and his ability to negotiate and deal with President Trump, right? I mean, I think
Do
he's.
you know how the Dutch refer to Mark Rutte?
Please tell me.
Teflon Rutte,
I mean,
because nothing ever sticks.
yep.
Yeah.
But I guess, but from your perspective, though, I mean, how are the Europeans viewing the Trump administration? Is it a holistic way they're analyzing? It is by certain figures. How, for an American audience, how do you believe Europe and the European Union? Because it's even interesting, some of those that were considered political allies of President Trump within Europe and the mega movement, make Europe great again, have kind of taken a step back from President Trump. They understand the kind of the toxicity for them from their domestic polling. Obviously, President Trump lost Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, probably his most political ally and Putin's most political ally. He's gone, so Hungary is probably much more aligned to Europe than before. So, how is the European Union viewing the Trump administration holistically or separately? How would you say?
I think there's sometimes. First of all, there's clearly an attempt to manage the White House. First of all, I think that's the focus of so many is there's clearly an attempt of national leaders, and even to an extent European Union leadership, but national leaders, to manage the White House, right? And President Trump, in particular, through um, uh, personal relationships with the man. Marco Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, is the most obvious case, but there are others. Friedrich Merz tried his hand at it. With Iran, things got a little spicier. Macron has this kind of um, how can I put it, ego competition with Donald Trump, because Macron and Trump are two guys with two large egos. So there's that. But on the other hand, Macron is the guy Trump knows better, right? Because he was already president of France in his first in Trump's first administration. So there's that. And then there are leaders like Meloni, who is a very pragmatic leader, and who has excellent relations with Washington. Um, and Polish, in Poland, you have two different things. The government has difficult more relations between the government and Donald Tusk's government is one thing. The president of Poland, being from PIS, has better relations with Donald Trump, as we saw in this issue of the forces moving to Poland, which is actually a good thing. Forces are much more needed in Poland than in Germany. Um, and it's worse for Russia, anyhow. But there's, I think people view this. There was an attempt to manage the White House, but it has now stabilized in a position where the Europeans, I think, decided to let the White House do their thing and we'll do ours, whatever, and we'll confront the White House when necessary. Not too ostensively, not too openly, but things will progress the way we did. I think Greenland played a very significant role in that. That's for sure. I think it was absolutely it was a moment where Europe clearly united around it, and it played a significant role in hardening some stances regarding the U.S. administration. But I think things will get to a natural point of friendly competition, where in some matters we'll be aligned, some matters we won't. Frankly, Stefano, frankly, the natural state of things, if you're dealing with a more united Europe and the US, no US administration of any kind, will like the idea of a united and federal Europe, for instance, right? No U.S. administration, be it the Democrats, be it the Republicans, MAGA, whatever, no one will like it, and no one will like it because a more united Europe is a less fragmented Europe. Is a Europe where you may have an ally, a more powerful ally for sure, but you also have in other matters a more powerful competitor, right? Because and that's the rub here, right? And much of this goes down to that. uh Neither the US, neither China, definitely not Russia, would like to see a united Europe, because a politically united Europe, a federal Europe, is someplace where that you won't be able to boss around. You won't be able to go into the national, to the member state level and disrupt it. And you'll be dealing with a player who's powerful, who's large, who's rich, and who has its own ideas, for sure, right? So it's much more hard, it's much more difficult for the Chinese, the Indians, or the Americans, and definitely the Russians, but the Chinese, the Indians, and the Americans, to deal with a united and powerful Europe than it is to deal with European states, right? So I think that's something that's the underlying strategic tension here. Because if you look at it, um, with all its problems, and we could be here all week enumerating the problems, but with all its problems, the European Union has, when many said it would break apart and whatnot, survived and has consolidated at the federal level in some areas. Take defense. Take Ukraine in defense, for instance. That's an important issue. Um, the European Union, by treaty, is barred of having anything to do with weapons procurement and defense procurement. By treaty, it's in the treaties. We cannot. The European Union cannot acquire weapons, acquire military capabilities, and yet you look at it, and Ukraine has been um, kept afloat, has been financed, we've bought uh, billions upon billions of euros in weapons for Ukraine through something called the European Peace Facility.
But I guess then the thing is though, because you were highlighting, a very key component there a little bit earlier about, this federalized Europe and how no administration will like that.
No,
But to just kind of continue that thread just a little bit, if I may, because I wanted to ask this: do you believe that any of the issues that we're seeing now currently within the Trump administration, one of the things that you constantly hear say is, "Oh, it's permanent damage. There's no going back." Do you think that's hyperbole? Do you think that if, let's say, a Marco Rubio administration or whatever Democrat might come, let's say even Gavin Newsom, whoever, pick your political leader in the United States, in 2028 gets elected, both Democrat or Republican, is much more in that traditional sense. Do you think that people might look at the crisis and the problems within the Trump administration, they're able to ignore and move on from that? Do you think there are areas of permanent damage? Maybe the Europeans finally realize we need our own conventional military force, our own deterrence. We can't be so dependent or reliant on the United States. Where are the areas where there's a no turning back? And where are the areas where we'd be like, okay, we can ignore everything that happened and continue working in these areas?
I don't think. I think it's an evolving relationship. Frankly, I don't think there's damage. There's damaging. There's damaging statements and damaging politics in all of this, but it's more than that. It's a fundamental shift. It's a fundamental shift, and it's a fundamental shift that was bound to occur. Actually, the guy who warned Europeans that it would occur was Robert Gates in his, I believe it was his farewell speech to the NATO Atlantic Council. I may be wrong, but Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, said that he was the last in a long line of transatlanticists that would hold, in Cold Warriors, that would hold power in the US. And the same is happening in Europe, right? So I think there's a fundamental shift, both as the United States um, tries to implement a more America first or a policy or a pivot to Asia policy, if whatever you call it, but a policy more focused on the U.S. interests. And there's a fundamental shift in Europe too, which is Europeans coming to terms that we need to have our own defense. Russia actually contributed for that. Um,
I mean, that's the
and
irony, right? Like the Russian invasion to Ukraine created what they were trying to prevent,
exactly.
right? I mean, the Finland, Sweden joining NATO, right?
the
This rise
Germans,
of
the
European
Germans,
defensive, yeah.
the Germans putting the 46th Panzer Brigade on the border of Russia permanently, right? Rearming of Germany. That's something. If I was a Russian strategist, that you don't want a united Europe with spending 400 billion a year in defense. You'll never match it.
I mean, and that's the irony. I mean, like it's like, and then the Russian military completely hollowed out, right? I mean, it's kind of, I find this hilarious and kind of crazy. The analysis that we've been kind of getting, we're like, well, because Russia can't defeat Ukraine, they might, in a couple of years or short time period, launch an attack against the Baltic to test NATO. You resolve, and I'm kind of like stopping to myself, Nuno, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, you're telling me that Russia, right now, got it, Ukraine has had years to kind of adapt and overcome. And the reason why I said this in a podcast, actually, which was, I think the reason why the Ukrainians have really prioritized drones is because they had significant issues in the manpower. And
Obviously,
and then
mobilization is
yeah,
one of the problems.
and then the issue is because Russia Ukraine has become a positional warfare, like a trench warfare. That's where the drones has become much more lethal. But the issue is, it's just it continues to reinforce a positional level warfare where neither side is able to develop the manpower and force structure capability wise to have translate tactical level breakthroughs to operational success that actually can translate to decisive victory. And so each side is basically fighting a war saying, well, one of them is eventually going to collapse. And it's like, we're
Yeah,
just not, and it's just not, unfortunately, the historical example I put was Iraq. That lasted
yeah,
8 years. And it could have kept on going. Like, it just ended because of just so much political pressure. But Khomeini, the Iranian supreme leader, did not want the war to end. He wanted to continue, right? And I think people are like, that lasted 8 years of just positional warfare. That the irony is they had more territorial change and controls than Russia, Ukraine, who are just doubling down and tripling down. So, go to that point, it's kind of like, so you're telling me that Russia, who's unable to break Ukraine during the beginning of the war, did terrible. You're going to launch an offensive against the Baltics and you're going to face Poland.
Germany,
Right. That you don't
Finland.
need the United States.
Yeah,
Frankly, that we've seen the Visegrad now redouble with out now with Orban gone. It's kind of looking at the center, as you have alluded to, the Nordic countries, right? I mean, it's almost like, and this has kind of been the argument from the United States, specifically as the U.S. is focusing on the Indo-Pacific or the Western Hemisphere, et cetera, says Europe, you need to do more for European security, right? And let's not forget, I mean, there's still U.S. force structure in Europe right now, a significant military presence, right? The 173rd, it looks like the 2nd Cavalry Regiment might have been one of the units that was going to pull out of Germany, might be the ones that have been sent over to Poland.
Poland. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's kind of like, I just, and oh, by the way, the Air Force structure there and the naval component is still very strong. So that's why I'm kind of scratching my head with some of these analysis and these takes about the Russians. But the other thing, and one of the things I wanted to ask you though, is because we saw the Greenland tension, right, and all the problems. But now when we're looking at the reporting, right, it's kind of like, and it's kind of getting buried because obviously Trump and his True Social says a lot of things and he wants to expand it and sees it for whatever reason. But the interesting development that's going on, and we've seen this from U.S. Northern Command, is saying, oh no, Denmark, even with all that, Denmark and Greenland are more than happy to give us more access to
military base,
military
more
bases.
access.
Right. And it looks like we're getting more military bases. And now the conversation is actually centering not only from the military bases perspective, it's now centering in this idea of trying to push Russia and China's economic interests outside of Greenland, specifically from the minerals. And we've seen the Nordic countries release a statement reprioritizing Arctic security, which is fundamental to the United States if you're looking at it from a NORTHCOM homeland defense, right? Arctic security is pivotal to the US, much more so than Europe. But it looks like even the Nordic countries have redoubled their effort in developing a conventional military capability to deter the Russians, to deter the Chinese in the Arctic. So it's kind of one of these questions where, yes, it is. Now, granted, the people in Greenland are obviously upset with the United States. Nobody's disputing that. We've seen protests against the U.S. consulates in Greenland, and
In Nuke.
that's
Yeah.
a new. But regardless, it does look like though what President Trump, and all the tensions and the problems it caused, it does push the Europeans to refocus on a lot of key security architectures and infrastructure and policies that, frankly, the European Union appears to have been neglecting and ignoring.
Yes, yes. I usually joke with some fellow Europeans and in the political circles of European federalists, and eventually we're gonna have to name an avenue or a building over Donald J. Trump as the founder father of the European Federation. We're gonna have to name a building. We're gonna have to name an avenue over him. It's gonna be the European External Action Service Donald J. Trump building or something like that. Because fundamentally, the Trump administration, uh, by nature of its players and by nature of the president itself, has really moved forward European integration in defense and European integration as a whole, right? Which is kind of, I don't know if it's exactly what Washington wanted. I can dispute. I don't see it as the outcome desired in Washington D.C. But in practice, that's what happened. And if you look at some of the things going a bit under the radar, you have an initiative like Pax Silica, right? The mineral and rare earths, critical minerals, basically, supply chain initiative that the U.S. Spearheaded, and that initiative is uh, a lot of most of Europe is in it. So there's, I mean, the relationship between the U.S. in Europe is fundamentally shifting. That's my point, and it's shifting in a sense that um, the US is more focused on the Western Hemisphere, on the Indo-Pacific, in its own interests. Um, of course, there's the all the cultural war stuff going on, but Europe has awakened to its security situation, to its defense situation, and we are clearly progressing in that. With all the issues and all the problems we yet have to solve, and there's quite a number of them. And the problems in defense are not what people think they are, by the way. I can say three things that are problems in defense that people at first glance won't say. People will talk money, will talk high end capabilities, will talk stuff like that. But the problems is defense industrial fragmentation, um, banking union, and also industrial and critical supply chains. That's not money. Money isn't our problem. I think that should be left out of the way. We don't have a problem with money.
What did you say? One of the other problems, though, within the European is kind of like look at the U.S. military, right? We have one tank and we have one APC, the Bradley and the Abrams, and then you look at the Europeans, and it's
You
like
have 20.
right, and I mean, granted, it's all within NATO standards, but still, it's not ideal. You, it's interesting because actually we were talking about Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, and I would agree with you. A lot of the tensions with the U.S. and Israel is more because of domestic politics, with the El Sumar, the left wing political party,
Exactly.
Podemos, the predecessors, the Catalans, and all that, and kind of that really weird
Zapatero and the
relationship.
Venezuelan,
Yeah,
Zapatero
yeah,
and the
yeah, yeah, and all
Venezuelan. Yeah.
that. Which whatever. I think that I had to analyze that because from a Marone perspective and all that, if it's that kind of interesting and ironic that if anything we saw a significant increase of U.S. military presence in Spain until this crisis than any other European country. But taking a step back, Pedro Sanchez, the prime minister, one of the arguments when all this happening was he was advocating for a unified European army. Right? He literally said it is time that we need to bring back a European army in the forefront of these conversations for a security architecture. I mean, my question to you, Nuno, right? I mean, is that a dream, or is that
That's
something that can be realistically achieved in whatever duration of time you think?
problem with that. Um, I'm a federalist, as you know. I'm a European federalist. No way around that. But I'm against an European army right now because an army, whatever form it may take, requires one thing: a political decision center. Who An European army would be, for all purposes, a nuclear power. Who decides to launch a nuclear strike? The European Commission? Is that it? That can't be. You can't have an European army unless you have a centralized European power, an elected power that a president, um, a prime minister of Europe, whatever you want to constitutionally call it, but unless you have a centralized power, a centralized political power, you military force is not a military force is not an option. A centralized military is not an option, and frankly, is something that we don't really need right now. What we need, and to go to your point of a lot of the different systems, that speaks to one of the things I said: fragmentation, defense industrial base fragmentation. We have a lot of member states with national champions, let's call it, major companies in their own state, Rheinmetall, Leonardo, KNDS, whatever. Um, but they are not an European champion to compete with the likes of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and whatnot, because despite their big dimension as companies, they are not an overarching European company supplying all countries, right? Let's say you have um, 10 makers of artillery in Europe, 10 companies who make artillery, 5 companies who make artillery in Europe. You need uh, to consolidate that in 2 or 3 companies eventually. There's no way around that. And that is done by pushing forward the European Defense Union as a single, the European defense market as part of the single market of the European Union, right? Um, Defense needs to come of age and needs to consolidate to create the necessary big companies um, to solidify our defense industrial base and to give it scale, the possibility to scale up uh, immensely. Obviously, this has a massive problem, which is the member states. Everyone wants to defend their companies, right? And this is one of the problems: the fragmentation of the defense industrial base. Actually, the Mario Draghi report on European competitiveness speaks to this. It's one of the key problems that he sees is this fragmentation of the European defense industry, and the other is the European banking union, where you in the capital market, where you need to create the united capital market, so we have the same uh, uh, financial uh, capabilities that the US market has, and the same financial leverage the US market has. And this leverage needs to be freed up for defense investment too. And that's essential. That's essential because Europe is sitting on trillions of euros of savings, trillions upon trillions, tens of trillions of euros on savings. So you need to banks and financial institutions need to be able to mobilize, and in a big 27 country market, to invest in defense. That's the way forward, not the European army. The European army is something that will, its time eventually may come, but if it comes, it needs to stem from political union more than anything else.
I mean, that's an excellent observation, and I would agree with that. And it's very interesting, right now, to your point about the nuclear launch, right? Under
Yeah,
NATO,
who authorizes?
that's secure, right? And it's really the U.S. and secure that handles that. And it's like the U.S. has the command infrastructure and the knowledge to really synthesize and organize a NATO military infrastructure in the European defense. Hence this argument, one way or another, and I'd even say like this idea of European bashing from some American political circles. It's like you're undermining the one thing that gives you the most amount of international presence and expansion and opportunities and projection of
In
power.
leverage, in
Yeah,
leverage,
leverage. It's the Europeans.
in
And oh, by
leverage.
the way, they're our largest trading partner, and if the EU was analyzed as a whole, would be one of the largest economies in the world. I mean, it's kind
The
of, and there
second,
are analyze with the Japanese. It's like, wait a minute, like all our allies are the richest countries in the world with the most powerful militaries around the world, excluding China at this point because Russia's military difficulties. So I would agree that has always been something that I kind of scratched my head in this idea, even within a construct of America first, which is fine. The best way to achieve America first and ensure that things don't reach the shores is through international alliances and empowering your allies.
no, and to your point, uh, if you want a really true America first policy, at, you give the European Union a safe, uh, how could I put it? You give the European Union a safe, sound, uneventful world, right? Where it can be bogged down in niche discussions, in regulation, in niche discussion. Don't give it a critical life or death issue every 5 years, because if you give it a safe and stable world, it will become irrelevant. But if you keep on giving it crisis upon crisis, it will build itself up, right? And the thing Washington needs to understand is, if you have Europe building itself up as a geopolitical power, with all its problems, sure, but with as a geopolitical power, there's a problem right there, because the US can say, okay, we leave you Europeans alone to defend the continent. We don't want anything to do with that. Sure, but next time you come asking for trades benefits, or you come asking for tariff relief, or you come asking for support against the Chinese, we'll go analyze it, because you don't have the leverage. Because the part of being the guarantor of European security was the idea that you retain leverage over Europe. A Europe that you don't retain leverage over is a Europe that may be more united, may have its own ideas, its own interests. They may or may not be compatible with the United States, or some will be, some won't be. Some will be competitive with the United States, and you have the second economy in the world. And that's something that people sometimes don't realize.
No,
Uh, they,
yeah, and I
the
think,
US is the first,
yep,
the European Union is the second,
second, yep.
China is the third.
Yeah, if you add, that's where I think a lot of people don't analyze. But Nuno, we are going to have to wrap. I mean, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I'd love to have you back. I think this European component is exactly one of the things that I wanted to really do, because it shows that how the United States and all these crises and events that are going on, and how we analyze it here, is could be fundamentally different from a European angle and perspective. We just don't have the opportunity to expand it, and that's why we had this podcast to do at the Bluff. But no, before we head out, I do want to give you the opportunity, any closing comments. But my one question to you is there something here that, as me as an American host, I've kind of been asking, and some of these might have even been perceived as American centric conversations. We've had episodes about the Sahel, we've had episodes about Southeast Asia, about Africa, about cartels, Latin America. But is there something that in this recording, in this episode, do you think I missed that from a European perspective might be more important?
I think there's one thing we all need to look at, and we need to do it fast, is Africa. And here, Africa is something we definitely, not only because of the terrorism, but because of Russian encroachment, Chinese encroachment, and the competition for resources. And even migration issues. And for us Europeans, I usually say that for us Europeans, there are three key elements of our overall European security: Eastern Front, Russia; the Arctic; and Africa. That's the three key things we need as Europeans. We need to worry about: the Arctic, the Russians, and Africa. Because listen, the Atlantic, I'm not very concerned about the Atlantic. We control the Atlantic. The United States controls the Atlantic. That's not a problem. And give it or not, the US is, even if our relations fundamentally shifts, we'll still be allied and we'll still be the biggest trading relationship in the world. But for European security, the East, Russia, the problem of Russia and the Central Eurasia issue, the issue of the Arctic, and you're fundamentally right about the Arctic. That's something that's it's a discussion really worth having. The discussion about Greenland uh, was made with a stick and a lot of a stick and cocaine, and it should be done with calm and collected. It should be in a calm and collected manner. It was done with stick and cocaine, but whatever.
I mean, I mean, and I think that's, we have had episodes extensively about Africa. I think we need to do another one. Obviously, we had Casas Belli,
Uh,
another
yeah, of the
phenomenal.
great episode, by the way.
Thank
I
you,
heard
thank
it.
you. I mean,
It was
great, but I
amazing.
do believe the one that we are missing, because we've talked about almost every geographical area around the world, but I think the one we briefly took, we did have an episode about Greenland when all of this kind of started in January, but it was very much centered again from a U.S. perspective. But I think you bring up an excellent point that we do need to have an Arctic security conversation,
Yeah,
and bring that in from the U.S., Canadian, European, and how the Russians and all that, and how the Chinese are going to. Because I think that's the one geographical area that we haven't covered as much as we should have, outside of just the Greenland, that we need to vastly expand on, because that is another geopolitical importance and area that is going on. But I do want to thank you very, very much for joining us.
thanks, brother.
Um,
Thanks for the invitation. First of all, it was a great pleasure, man. Thanks.
no,
Great conversation.
and I would love to have you again, especially from the European
Anytime.
perspective. And even maybe the other one is we have a defense bulletin, John Lareer, as our military analyst a lot of times. I'd love to have you both as well, especially in times of war crisis, maybe Russia, Ukraine, or maybe Iran. Just before we end the recording, Nuno, I will say that right now, we're getting reported. It looks like maybe the MOU is not as doing so well as it should have. Of course, shockingly, right? Again, we don't.
Shockingly right.
Yeah, I do believe, like I do believe that I would say that I would be very cautious how the Iranian media is presenting this, because they try to do this. But I'm going to end it with this quote, Nuno. I think you're going to love this. So this is from Fatux Networks. I know you and I deal extensively with Fatux, specifically some of the people in the network, but this is a great quote that they just released. Quote: U.S. and Iran agree in principle to a deal, then disagree on every single clause, unquote. A European official speaking to Fatux Network says. I think that is exactly how we're going to end this, because it is so true. And maybe that's what we're going to discuss in our next episode. But Nuno, thank you so much to everybody
Thank you
listening.
so much, brother. It's a pleasure being here.
Yeah, man.
Bye.
And to everybody, thank you very much. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast, and we will see you soon.